February 1st, 1943. The air above the Bismarck Sea tastes of salt and burning metal. At 22,000 feet, the sky is a cathedral of blue silence, broken only by the drone of Wright Cyclone engines pushing B-17 flying fortresses through the troposphere. Inside the cockpit of a bomber designated Southern Belle, Second Lieutenant James Ward feels the yoke vibrate beneath his gloved hands. Below, the Pacific spreads endless and indifferent, a sheet of hammered silver reflecting the equatorial sun. He does not know that in 17 minutes, his aircraft will become a flying casket. Or a miracle. History has not yet decided which. The formation is tight. 11 bombers moving as one mechanical organism, their aluminum bodies glinting like a school of enormous fish. Ward checks his instruments with the methodical precision drilled into him at Hendricks Field, Florida, where the instructors spoke of altitude and airspeed as if they were prayers. Oil pressure steady. Manifold pressure nominal. The intercom crackles with the voice of Staff Sergeant Daniel Knox, the tail gunner, reporting bandits at 4 o'clock high. Ward's throat tightens. He has flown 14 missions over the Southwest Pacific. He has seen fortresses explode into clouds of aluminum confetti. He has watched parachutes blossom like white flowers against the green hell of New Guinea's jungle. But knowledge does not inoculate against fear. It only teaches you its true dimensions. The Japanese fighters come out of the sun. 7 Mitsubishi A6M0s, their cowlings painted with the blood-red circle of the rising sun. They are flown by men of the 582nd Kokutai, pilots who learned their craft over China, who perfected it in the skies above Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. Men who believe their emperor is divine, that death in his service is the highest form of poetry. The Zeros are nimble, vicious, designed for the knife fight of aerial combat. The B-17 is a truck by comparison, built to absorb punishment and delivered 2,500 pounds of high explosive to a target coordinates on a map. In the algebra of war, these two philosophies are about to collide at 300 miles per hour. The first pass is chaos, translated into physics. 20-millimeter cannon shells walk across Southern Belle's left wing, punching holes the size of dinner plates through aluminum skin. The noise inside the fuselage is apocalyptic, a jackhammer symphony of tearing metal and explosive decompression. Ward banks hard right, trying to stay within the protective crossfire of the formation, but 1-0 follows, committed, its pilot squeezing the trigger in disciplined bursts. Tracers arc through the air like malevolent fireflies. The smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid floods the cockpit. Ward's co-pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Hayes, is shouting altimeter readings, but the words are swallowed by the roar of wind through shrapnel holes. Through the plexiglass, Ward sees the Zero pull up and away, trailing a thin streamer of white smoke. He does not feel relief. He feels the aircraft shudder beneath him like a dying animal. Then the wing breaks. Not completely, not the clean catastrophic failure that sends a bomber tumbling through 20,000 feet of empty air in 8 seconds. The outer third of the left wing, from the number 2 engine to the wingtip, simply folds upward at a 45-degree angle, held on by fuel lines, control cables, and some mysterious grace of structural engineering that should not exist. The B-17 lurches violently left. Ward's instruments lie. The artificial horizon shows a bank angle that should mean they are already spinning into the sea. But they are not spinning. They are flying, barely held, aloft by 3 engines, 1 wing, and the stubborn refusal of riveted aluminum to acknowledge its own impossibility. Hayes is screaming to bail out. Through the intercom, the crew is a chorus of panic and prayer. Knox in the tail reports the wing flapping in the slipstream like a broken bird. The navigator, Second Lieutenant Michael Kowalski, calculates they are 140 nautical miles from Port Moresby. It might as well be the moon. Every aeronautical engineer, every physics textbook, every rational analysis of lift and drag and structural integrity says Southern Belle should be in the ocean already, her crew crushed by impact or drowned in their positions. But Ward does not bail out. He makes a decision that seems, in the moment, less like courage and more like insanity. He will fly her home. To understand what happens next, you must first understand what they expected. The young men who climbed into bombers above the Pacific in 1943 expected war to follow certain rules, certain narratives absorbed from newsreels and pulp magazines. They expected heroism to be clean, outcomes to be binary. You fought, you won or lost, you came home or you didn't. The machinery was supposed to be reliable, the training sufficient, the cause righteous enough to smooth the edges of terror. What they did not expect was ambiguity, the gray space where a broken airplane refuses to fall, where survival depends not on doctrine but on improvisation, not on what you were taught, but but on what you invent in the moment between heartbeat and disaster. Ward begins the longest 17 minutes of his life. He cannot maintain altitude. Southern Belle is sinking at 200 feet per minute, a slow-motion descent toward the Bismarck Sea. He cannot maintain airspeed without the drag from the crippled wing pulling them into a spin. He cannot turn more than 5 degrees without the aircraft threatening to roll inverted, so he flies in an almost straight line, nursing the throttles on the 3 functioning engines, making micro-adjustments to trim tabs that were never designed to compensate for a wing folded like origami. Hayes has gone silent, his hands on the dual controls, matching Ward's movements with the synchronization of a dance. Partner. The rest of the crew remains at their stations. No one jumps. Later, when historians ask why, the answers will be vague. Loyalty, trust, the primal human resistance to stepping into 20,000 feet of nothing. But perhaps the real reason is simpler. They believe Ward can do this. Belief, in such moments, becomes a form of structural support. The Zero pilot who inflicted this damage probably reported the kill. In his debriefing with the 582nd Kokutai, he would have described the American bomber's wing folding, the aircraft dropping from formation, the inevitable conclusion. Such reports were common. The Pacific War was a mathematics of attrition. Every downed bomber was a moral victory for pilots trained to view Americans as soft, decadent, worshippers of material comfort who would break when confronted with true martial spirit. The samurai code, Bushido, taught that spirit could overcome material disadvantage. But what the Zero pilot did not see, what he could not see as he turned back toward Rabaul, his ammunition expended, was that American material advantage was not separate from American spirit. It was an expression of it. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not an elegant aircraft, it was a brutal industrial product, designed by engineers at Boeing who understood that perfection was the enemy of production. Every bomber that rolled off the assembly line in Seattle embodied a philosophy: redundancy, over-engineering, the assumption that things would break and the machine needed to keep functioning anyway. 4 engines when 3 would do, dual hydraulic systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, a structural framework that distributed stress across multiple load paths. The men who designed the B-17 never imagined a scenario where a third of the wing would fold skyward and the aircraft would continue flying. But they built it robust enough that the unimaginable became merely improbable. Ward's altimeter reads 8,000 feet. They have been descending for 9 minutes. Port Moresby is still 80 miles away. The mathematics is brutal and simple. They will hit the ocean 15 miles short of land. Below, the Bismarck Sea is no longer silver. It is dark blue, almost black, detailed now with the texture of swells and whitecaps. Ward can see individual waves. He thinks about his mother in Tulsa, who writes him letters about victory gardens and scrap metal drives, who believes her son is fighting in a clean war of clear purposes. He thinks about his fiancée Catherine, who wears his ring and waits. He does not think about dying. There is no space in his mind for that luxury. Every neuron is dedicated to the problem of airspeed versus drag, of asymmetric thrust versus yaw, of keeping the aircraft in a configuration that defies every law of aerodynamics except the most important one: it is still in the air. At 6,000 feet, something changes. Ward feels it through the yoke before he sees it on the instruments. The aircraft becomes fractionally more stable. Perhaps a control cable has shifted. Perhaps metal fatigue has reached some new equilibrium. Or perhaps, and this is what the engineers will argue about for decades, the aerodynamic forces acting on the folded wing create an unexpected lifting body effect, a quirk of fluid dynamics that partially compensates for the missing surface area. Ward does not question it. He accepts the gift. He trims the aircraft again, coaxing another 10 knots of airspeed, trading altitude for forward momentum. The ocean is close enough now that he can see the shadows of clouds moving across the water. 4,000 feet, 3,000. Hayes spots the coastline, a dark green line between sea and sky. Port Moresby, the most beautiful word in the English language, but Ward cannot land. Not conventionally. Southern Belle's approach speed, with one wing crippled, is 60 knots faster than the runway can accommodate. The landing gear may not extend evenly. The aircraft will almost certainly ground loop, cartwheeling into a fireball that will kill everyone aboard. So Ward makes his second impossible decision. He will ditch. Not in the ocean, they are past that now, but in the shallows just offshore, where the water is deep enough to cushion impact, but shallow enough that rescue boats can reach them. It is a plan born of desperation and clarity. Hayes begins calling out the checklist. Kowalski and the bombardier, Second Lieutenant Frank Richter, move to crash positions. Knox, in the tail, braces himself against the bulkhead. The radio operator, Technical Sergeant William Sawyer, transmits their intentions to Port Moresby Tower. The response is static and disbelief. At 500 feet, Ward lines up parallel to the coast. The beach is a ribbon of white sand. Beyond it, palm trees and the smoke from cooking fires. People are running out of huts pointing at the sky. To them, Southern Belle is an apparition, a crippled machine held aloft by forces that seem more spiritual than mechanical. Ward reduces throttle. The ocean rushes up. He can see the coral reefs beneath the surface, dark shadows and turquoise water. At 100 feet, the aircraft is barely flying, barely controlled, a 10-ton glider with the aerodynamic efficiency of a brick. 50 feet, 25. Hayes is counting down altitude. Ward pulls back on the yoke, flaring, trying to bleed off the last of their airspeed. The tail hits first, a jolt that snaps heads forward. Then the fuselage, skipping once across the surface before settling into the water with a deceleration that crushes ribs against harness straps and slams faces into instrument panels. And then silence. The terrible ringing silence after violence. Water pours through the shrapnel holes. The aircraft is sinking, but slowly, majestically, as if reluctant to surrender. Ward unbuckles, his hands moving with the automatic precision of training. The crew evacuates in 40 seconds. Out through the waist gun windows, out through the top. Hatch. Dropping into chest-deep water that is warm and clear and alive with fish, they wade toward shore, dragging 2 wounded men, Sawyer, who has broken his collarbone, and the ball turret gunner, Staff Sergeant James O'Connor, who is bleeding from a scalp laceration. Behind them, Southern Belle settles into the sand, her broken wings still raised like a salute or a surrender. The Australian ground crew that reaches them 20 minutes later finds Ward sitting on the beach, soaked and shaking, staring at the wreckage. He is crying, though he will not remember this later. What he will remember is the feel of the yoke in his hands, the vibration of an aircraft that should not have flown but did. The story should end there. Miraculous survival, crew intact, aircraft lost, but mission survived. The Pacific War is full of such stories, small dramas of endurance that get folded into the larger narrative of Allied victory. But what happened to Southern Belle became something else. Within days, photographs of the wreck circulated through the 5th Air Force. The image of the B-17 with its wing bent skyward, resting in shallow water like a wounded angel, appeared in Stars and Stripes, in Life magazine, on the newsreel screens in theaters from Boston to Los Angeles. It became proof of something Americans needed to believe, that their machines were as resilient as their ideals, that abundance and democracy and industrial might could absorb punishment that would shatter more brittle philosophies. To the Japanese pilots who learned of Southern Belle's survival, and they did learn through intelligence reports and interrogations, the reaction was more complex. There was respect for Ward's skill, certainly. Bushido honored courage even in an enemy. But there was also a deepening unease, a recognition that they were not fighting men who would break under pressure. They were fighting an industrial system that produced aircraft faster than they could shoot them down, a society that could afford to over-engineer, to build in redundancies, to treat mechanical failure as an expected variable rather than a catastrophic exception. Every B-17 that limped home missing engines, with fuselages riddled with holes, with tail sections shot away, was a psychological defeat. It suggested that American material superiority was not a weakness to be overcome by spirit, but an expression of a different kind of strength, one rooted in pragmatism, adaptability, the belief that problems were meant to be solved rather than transcended. Ward flew 16 more missions before his tour ended in August 1943. He returned to Tulsa, married Catherine, and became a flight instructor at Randolph Field, Texas, teaching a new generation of pilots the mechanics of staying alive. He never spoke much about February 1st. When pressed, he would say only that the aircraft flew itself, that his crew deserved the credit, that luck mattered more than skill. This was both true and false. Luck mattered, skill mattered. But what mattered most was a quality harder to name, a refusal to accept the verdict of circumstance, a stubborn insistence that impossible was merely a starting point for negotiation. The wreckage of Southern Belle remained in the shallows off Port Moresby for 3 months before salvage crews removed it. By then, it had been picked clean by souvenir hunters. Panels of aluminum, fragments of plexiglass, a control yoke, pieces of the broken wing. These fragments scattered across the world, carried home by soldiers who wanted proof that they had witnessed something beyond the ordinary brutality of war. Some ended up in museums. Some were mounted on den walls in suburbs. One piece, a section of the wing spar, still bearing the stress fractures from that final flight, was sent to Boeing's engineering division in Seattle. For years it sat in a laboratory, studied by analysts trying to understand how metal could bend so far without breaking completely. The equations are never quite balanced. The models always predicted catastrophic failure. The wing should not have held, but it did. In the decades after the war, Ward received letters from Japanese veterans' messages filtered through translators and veterans' associations. They were formal, cautious, but they shared a common thread, a desire to understand the men they had fought. One letter from a former Zero pilot named Takeo Shibata, who may or may not have been the man who crippled Southern Belle, asked a simple question: "What did you think about in those minutes when your wing was broken?" Ward's response, typed on onion skin paper in 1968, was equally simple: "I thought about getting my crew home. I thought about the people who built the aircraft. I thought about how angry I would be if we crashed after coming so far." That anger, that refusal, is perhaps the most American part of the story. It is not jingoism or exceptionalism. It is something more fundamental, a cultural disposition toward problem solving, a belief that systems should work, and when they fail, they should fail gracefully. The B-17 was designed by men who understood Murphy's Law before it had a name. The pilots were trained in a tradition that valued improvisation as much as doctrine, and the society that produced both understood, at some inarticulate level, that resilience is not about avoiding damage. It is about continuing to function despite it. The symbolic object in this story is not food, not a weapon, but the rivet. Millions of them, holding Southern Belle together, each one a small promise: "I will bear my share of the load." When some failed, when cannon shells tore through aluminum, when stress fractures propagated through the wing spar, others held. The redundancy was not waste, it was wisdom. It was the mechanical embodiment of a democratic principle, that no single point of failure should doom the whole, that the collective can bear what the individual cannot. In the authoritarian logic of the Axis powers, strength flowed from purity, from hierarchy, from the willingness to sacrifice the part for the whole. In the messy, pragmatic logic of American engineering, strength flowed from interdependence, from overbuilding, from the assumption that everything eventually breaks and the system must accommodate that reality. Ward died in 1987 at the age of 66, of a heart attack while mowing his lawn in Tulsa. His obituary in the local paper was brief: mention of his service, his marriage, his children, his work as a flight instructor, and later as a safety inspector for American Airlines. There was a paragraph about Southern Belle, but it was dry, factual, stripped of context. The journalist who wrote it did not understand that he was describing a moment when physics bent, when statistics relented, when a man and a machine negotiated with impossibility and won. Catherine kept Ward's medals in a drawer. She kept his logbook. She kept a photograph taken on the beach at Port Moresby showing Ward standing beside the wreck, his flight suit dark with seawater, his hand resting on the fuselage as if comforting a wounded animal. The crew of Southern Belle scattered after the war. Hayes became a commercial pilot. Kowalski taught mathematics at a high school in Ohio. Knox ran a hardware store in Georgia. Richter drank himself to death by 1950, unable to reconcile what he had survived with what he had seen. Sawyer and O'Connor stayed in touch, exchanging Christmas cards for 40 years, each card ending with the same line, "Still here." They reunited once, in 1983, at an 8th Air Force memorial service in Savannah. They were old men by then, thick in the middle, thin in the hair, carrying the invisible shrapnel of memory. They did not talk much about the war. What was there to say? They had flown together through fire. They had survived a moment that should have killed them. Language was inadequate to the experience, so they sat in silence, drinking coffee, watching a younger generation walk past, and understood each other perfectly. In the archives of the National Museum of the United States Air Force, in a climate-controlled vault beneath Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, there is a file labeled Incident Report, B-17 degrees Fahrenheit, serial number 42 to 30,177, February 1st, 1943. It contains maintenance logs, damage assessments, witness statements, and a handwritten note from an engineering officer named Captain Donald Pierce, who inspected the wreckage. The note reads, "Wing attachment remained intact despite catastrophic structural failure of outer panel. Recommend analysis of rivet pattern and load distribution for future design improvements. Also recommend commendation for pilot. What he did should not have been possible." That final sentence is underlined twice. Should not have been possible. But possibility is not fixed. It is negotiated, moment by moment, between human will and physical law, between what we know and what we dare to attempt. The story of Southern Belle is not about a miracle. It is about the margin of error, literal and philosophical, that democratic societies build into their systems. It is about the expectation of failure and the refusal to let failure be final. It is about 7,000 rivets doing their job when 2,000 failed. It is about an aircraft that flew on stubbornness and luck, and the uncanny grace that sometimes emerges from good design under catastrophic stress. And it is about a pilot who held the yoke steady when every instinct screamed to let go, who trusted the machine because men he never met had built it to be trustworthy, who brought his crew home not because he was fearless, but because fear was not permission to quit. In the calculus of war, this is recorded as a single data point: 1 aircraft damaged, 0 casualties, mission incomplete but crew recovered. But in the calculus of meaning, it is something larger. A testament to the stubborn, improvisational, over-engineered resilience that wins wars not through single heroic gestures, but through 10,000 small refusals to accept the inevitable. February 1st, 1943. A B-17 with half a wing missing flies toward Port Moresby. Inside, 7 men who should be dead are still breathing. Outside, the Pacific War grinds on, islands taken and lost, ships sunk, aircraft spiraling into the sea. But for 17 minutes, in one small corner of the sky, impossibility hesitates. Physics bends, metal holds, and a pilot named James Ward flies the broken angel home.